Good afternoon, ThinkyCon. I'm Dom Camus, and this is my talk about how puzzles are for supervillains. So, I started thinking about this when I was chatting to someone about Alexander the Great and the Gordian Knot. And I imagine that most of you know about the Gordian Knot, but I'll just briefly summarise. So Alexander the Great was in the process of invading Persia, which is not a small job. He came to a place where there was an ox cart tied up with a large and complicated knot, and was informed that there was a prophecy that the land would come to be ruled by whoever could separate the cart from the post. And this untying this knot was obviously going to be a very tricky puzzle. So in the version of the story which we now typically hear, Alexander drew his sword and cut through the knot, thereby separating the cart from the post as instructed. And indeed, he did go on to become the ruler of the land, so the prophecy was fulfilled. When this is discussed on the internet, it's often pointed out that Alexander had a huge army with him, and although this place was the capital of the old kingdom of Phrygia, this is Gordian, the place where the Gordian Knot was. Nonetheless, there was no real possibility of resisting his army. It was enormous. So it sort of made sense to say, oh yeah, you cut the knot. You're a genius. You fulfilled the prophecy. So now we don't need to fight you. But in fact, like many myths, there's more than one version of this story. And the version of the story that we have that is arguably, I'm not a historian, but it's arguably closest to history because it is allegedly based on an account from someone who was there at the time, tells the story a bit differently. So there was indeed this ox cart and the knot, and there was indeed this prophecy that whoever separated the two would become ruler of the land. But there's two things about this. Is firstly, it wasn't really a random challenge. This ox cart apparently had a lot of significance because the previous line of kings of Phrygia had been chosen by means of another prophecy, which said that the next person that came to the city would become the new ruler. They were without a king at the time, and as I've heard it told, literally just some random peasant rocked up and they were like, great, you're king now, congratulations. And the ox cart was tied up and then subsequently not removed. But so it wasn't intended as a challenge. This knot was simply there, or at least it probably had not just been used to secure the cart. It likely had been tied by the priesthood for some ritual purpose, you can say. And when Alexander, according to this version, came across it, he didn't cut it with his sword at all. To start with, he spent a while trying to untie it, and then he realised that what he needed to do was to pull the linchpin out that attached the knot to the pole, and then it became significantly easier to unravel. Which makes more sense, because why would you secure your ox cart to a pole in such a way that you couldn't remove it, right? It's a strange thing to do. But I'm interested in puzzles. What struck me about this version of the story is wait a minute, we have a historical version in which Alexander is actually solving the puzzle, which is, it's admirable as far as I'm concerned. And then we have the retold version, which has become very popular, in which he just cuts through the rope, which not only doesn't really solve the problem, but as has been pointed out, is he could simply have refused to engage with it at all. What's gained by cutting through the rope? And you get people casting this as an example of lateral thinking. But I'm inclined to see it as more of a cultural thing. There's this kind of cultural feeling that if you are faced with a hard problem and you can just bypass it entirely, that is somehow admirable. And that's the thing that struck me as interesting. So let's talk about puzzle games. So the Gordian Knot was supposed to be very hard to untie. Right? It's kind of the point of it in the context of the story. And as puzzle solvers, but more than that, as puzzle designers, we care really a lot about how difficult puzzles are. And I had a quick look through. I couldn't resist gathering some of the data. The word hard is actually used more than the word fun in all the puzzle design communities that I'm involved in. Which, I can't have been all that surprised, right? Or I wouldn't have looked, but it's interesting. It says something about how we engage with these ideas. And I think it does make some sense. Right? It's not a crazy thing. It makes some sense because it's a question in part of accessibility, by which I mean who can play a puzzle game. It's a kind of a gating thing, right? If your puzzle is hard, then some subset of the players just can't play at all, and so they definitely won't have any fun. But the other side of the coin is, unlike some types of game, it's in the nature of puzzles to require some amount of difficulty, because if a puzzle is too easy, you arguably get no gameplay at all. It's like you just immediately see what you have to do. You execute it. There's no thinking, right? And the thinking part is something I enjoy, and if you're watching this, it's probably something you enjoy as well. So it's an important part of what's going on. So this idea that you've got some need for difficulty in puzzles, but the whole question of puzzle design is about how hard you should make your puzzle. It's sort of obvious, which made me wonder: is it actually true? Like many things which we take to be obvious turn out not to be true at all. And I started to think about another way of looking at it, which is a lot of the time when I personally give up on a puzzle, so I try and solve it and then I eventually don't solve it and I move on from it, it's not actually that the puzzle is so hard that I couldn't do it. It's that it becomes kind of demotivating, is I no longer want to solve it. And whatever it is I'm going to get out of solving it is not worth the effort I would have to put in. So it's as though these puzzles are not impossible, but just demotivating. And so if that's why we are concerned by the whole issue of hard puzzles, then there's this related question of, well, what is the payoff for solving a puzzle, right? Because if the payoff is we feel a sense of achievement, then you would think perhaps that the harder a puzzle becomes, the more sense of achievement we would get. And so no matter how hard the obstacle became, we wouldn't get this demotivational effect. And I think that what's going on here is it has to do with the reason why solving things like this, doing hard things, does motivate us, or seemingly. And it's this whole question of rating yourself. So there's a kind of ego thing going on here, right? It's like if I can solve hard puzzles, then I too will conquer all of Persia. It's again, it's a culturally valued thing. It's like to be able to overcome a hard challenge, you receive a sort of not reputation, because no one will ever hear about it, but you're made to feel good about yourself by a sort of a big complicated system of cultural ideas. And having gone through the school system myself in the 1980s, this is something that comes through the way that education works, or it certainly used to. This idea that you should always be competing with everyone around you, and that there are rewards for the people who do well. And if you look at the kinds of people who play puzzle games, you do get a lot of people who have sort of done well for themselves academically, like who came through the school system, they did well, and so it plays into that same mindset to overcome this difficult challenge. And I was thinking about this in the context of competitive video games. So puzzle games, at least in the video game space, they tend not to be very competitive, in the sense of directly competing with another individual. But if you think about sort of mind sports like sort of chess and Go and bridge and that sort of thing, they are competitive. And then if you think about video games a little bit outside puzzles, again, there's lots of competition. And in this case, what I had in mind was a lot of the time with digital games, it's possible to matchmake amongst thousands and thousands of players, because some of these games are huge. So Blizzard Entertainment, who make Hearthstone and Overwatch and things like this, they have a policy of configuring their matchmakers so that they always try to match each player with someone as close to their own rating as possible. And these ratings are very like chess ratings; they work in a similar way. And online, you see lots of complaints about this from the players. Like, people don't like it. And I was thinking that's very strange, because on some level, it makes perfect matches. It's like if your opponent is always at exactly the same level as you. But it was a psychology thing. Is people didn't like it because it meant that they were winning half their games, regardless of how well they played. So you could log on and pay very little attention and be chatting to your friend, playing Hearthstone with one hand or whatever, and you would win half your matches. Or you could be absolutely focused and you could practice 40 hours a week or whatever, and you would still win half your matches. And it somehow felt very unrewarding. But also I think there's an element of people who are quite competitive. They're often used to situations in real life where they do win more than half the time, and that kind of primes your psychology to not like losing at anything. Which coming back to puzzle design, that's a problem, right? We're trying to design puzzles to entertain people. We don't want to make them sad. So there's this rather nice quotation that I'm fond of, which we don't quite know who originally said it. We think it was a guy called Don Marquis, he was a newspaper columnist in the US, sort of roughly a century ago. But the quote in question is, "If you make people think they are thinking, they will love you. If you really make them think, they'll hate you." And it's quite a sharp observation on human psychology, and you can see it all around you. I'm not talking about the puzzle world so much as just in the wider world. This is the case. People don't seem to enjoy the kinds of thinky pastimes that we like. And so I think thinking about this idea in the context of puzzles, it's like, what does this tell us about puzzle design? How we want to go about designing puzzles? And like particularly in the context of this idea that that people like to win. So you've got on the one hand, if you present people with a real challenge, that they'll find it on some level distressing, or maybe. And on the other side of the coin, if you don't present them with any challenge, you have to somehow create the illusion that they're succeeding, or they won't find it fulfilling. Puzzles don't do this. I did look around for some examples. Puzzles don't do this, and I think that's it's partly the culture of the puzzle world. It's partly because it's just not very practical. But other types of games have occasionally tried. You've had video games. I think there was an example in one of the Metal Gear games where you're trying to struggle through this corridor. It's full of microwaves or something, but it's the protagonist is getting harmed by it, and you have to hammer the button on your controller really fast. But the problem is that if you fail, the character just dies, which is boring, of course. You just have to redo it. But the designers wanted it to feel like you'd only just made it through, and so the challenge auto calibrates itself to how well you're doing, and so it's in some sense the whole thing is fake, which might be okay in a game like that because it's a story-driven game. But it's I would feel bad about that in a puzzle, right? So this is where I found myself at the title of this talk, because so we seem to be in a society which admires people cutting the Gordian knot and thereby bypassing puzzles, and we have this thing where actual obstacles on some level make people hate you. So puzzles are for villains, right? I mean, this doesn't sound good. And then you then have this thing where, okay, so you're watching a movie or something, and the heroes are fighting off waves of anonymous thugs, but they're not throwing puzzles around, right? So it's not just puzzles for the bad guys. Puzzles are for supervillains. They are the the nemesis, the arch enemy, as it were. It's one of their tools. So in puzzle design, is this all that we're doing? Is it just a contest, like a mental contest between puzzle designers and puzzle players? And if so, is that even something we want to be involved in? Is that good? So, as you would have guessed, my answer to this is no. This is not how things are. And so, what I want to do is to present another way of looking at this, which I think could represent an improvement on the way that these things are often talked about in the puzzle community. I think we do often talk about puzzle difficulty a lot. We talk about difficulty curves a lot in ways that don't necessarily help our design. And so it's possible that we can do better. So the point of origin of this idea was actually something that I made, that when I made it, I didn't realize how important it would turn out to be. And this was in the context of, I published a small puzzle game called The Golem. And this particular thing was not part of the game. It was in one of the menu pages describing the game when you first load it up. And it reads, "No matter how great or small your accomplishments, to take time to think about a difficult problem is a beautiful thing." And what was surprising about this is that this was by far the number one thing that got talked about and quoted and retweeted and so forth after the game's release. Is something about it just seemed to resonate with people, and it was as though I had accidentally said something that these people needed to hear, and I hadn't realised, and maybe they hadn't realised either. So once this happened, I then returned to this thing and thought, oh, so what is it about this? And I think what it is that it gives puzzle players permission to enjoy what they're doing. Which, it seems extraordinary because it's like they're playing a game. This is their leisure time. Why would they not enjoy it? But I think sometimes people don't. And it's because of this whole sort of competitive, ego-driven side, that this idea of overcoming a challenge, it can feel a bit like work. And I have heard people say sometimes that, I say, I make puzzle games. They say, I don't play puzzles because they feel too much like work. So what I want to ask today is, can this way of looking at things be not just for players, but can it also become a guide of sorts for puzzle designers, for us? Can it teach us how to make better puzzles in some way? So we have this, we've established an impassable object is demotivating. And, I've certainly felt that myself. So what can we do about this? Well, we could find ways to enable the player to pass an obstacle that they're stuck on. And, this is not a new problem in puzzle design. People have thought about this. And the other thing as well is that, as well as helping people pass seemingly insurmountable obstacles, can we help them to enjoy the process of solving even before they succeed? So that being stuck is fun, right? Because if all they're doing is staring at the thing and thinking, I can't work out how to pass this, that's not a necessary property of a hard puzzle, that they can't work on it at all. And conversely, when we make easy things, I'm not suggesting we just make hard things, when we make easy things, is there some way to make it so that even if you pass an easy puzzle in seconds, that it's somehow still interesting? Can we do that? And so the problem with this as advice is that if I say make things motivating and fun, that's not useful advice, right? Because it's so obvious. Anytime this comes up in many contexts. Anytime you can take a piece of advice and invert it, and the backwards form of the advice sounds like complete nonsense, then the advice wasn't really useful. So I think that the real message here isn't make things motivating and fun. The real message here is, don't reject your puzzles because you worried that they're too hard or too easy. That's the real mistake that people make, right? And we've come up with all these. Well, I haven't. The community has come up with all these tools. So things like, for example, letting people play levels in different order. That helps with people being stuck. Optional difficulty levels. So most games don't have this, but sometimes you'll get a thing where it's like, complete the level. Can you also do this other thing at the same time? It's like a difficulty level. Hint systems, they can be very good. In fact, brief shout out to the Sokobond Express, which I played earlier this year, which has a really nice hint system because it manages to help you without actually spoiling what you're doing, which is impressive. But yeah, all of these things, all of these mechanisms, I think are actually distractions from what we really need to be doing, which is making sure that the core puzzle is actually interesting. And that might sound obvious as well, but apparently it isn't, because so I run a Steam Curator group. It's not that large, it's just puzzle games. And as a result of this, I often get sent free copies of puzzle games. It's like, play this, write a review. And I almost always decline. And the reason, by far the number one reason why I decline is because the developer in question has made a puzzle game. But that's all they've done. They've just made a puzzle game, and in just a few seconds of looking at what they've done, I'm like, well, I have no interest in playing this. And it's not because they've done a bad job, it's because they've made something that is like the the core mechanics are something I'm not interested in exploring. I can see that it's going to be possible to make puzzles with them, but there's nothing, largely because I've played too many puzzles, right? But there's nothing there that really grabs my attention and makes me want to play. And we're back to this idea of it just feels like work. So just a couple of kind of summarizing remarks to sort of condense things down. So there's a nice quote by G.K. Chesterton, who said, "Anything worth doing is worth doing badly." And so that's my conclusion from the player side of things, is if you're going to play puzzle games, give yourself permission to play badly, because if you're constantly assessing yourself and forcing yourself to be sort of quick and clever and all the rest of it, there is that risk that it will start to feel like work, and you're missing, I think, the most enjoyable part of the hobby. And then from the design side, as a designer, be an art gallery curator, not a supervillain. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to find an interesting puzzle, right? Something that people will want to solve. And then your job is to find the best possible way to show the player what's interesting about it. Like that's the business of puzzle design. And it's not about setting the right difficulty level. It's not about your difficulty curve. It's not about the order in which players solve the puzzles. Find something that's worth their time and then show it off in the best way that you can find to give people the maximum enjoyment, to let them share your joy in what you found. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening.